Hello, listener. It's time to dive into the Juniverse, where tales of infidelity, betrayal, and heart-wrenching confessions pull you into the vast unknown.
James had always believed in the simplicity of his life. At 42, he was a successful architect, surrounded by achievements, his dream home in the suburbs, a fulfilling career, and a loving family. His wife, Claire, 34, a smart and ambitious marketing executive, had always been by his side, despite their occasional disagreements. But James never suspected that his perfect world would shatter so violently. It was an ordinary evening, or so he thought. James had decided to surprise Claire with an early return from a business trip, planning a romantic evening. As he walked up to their front door, something felt off. The front porch lights flickered in an odd, uninviting way. A strange silence gripped the house. Inside, his 2-year-old son, Ethan, was eerily quiet in his crib. But Claire? She was nowhere to be found. His instincts flared. He crept closer to the bedroom, where a faint sound caught his attention, a muffled, drunken laughter. His heart skipped a beat as he pushed the door open just a crack. What he saw took the air from his lungs. There, in their bed, was Claire naked, desperately clutching at the sheets. Her eyes wide with shock. But what was more terrifying was the man beside her, someone James had never seen before. Before he could even react, the man leapt from the bed and bolted for the window, disappearing into the night like a thief in the dark. The image of his wife, exposed and vulnerable, burned into James's mind. But it didn't end there. Claire's reaction was far from what James had expected. As she scrambled to put on clothes, she looked up at him with a forced laugh and waved her hand dismissively. "It's not what you think. It's a mistake. There's no one here," she muttered, trying to deflect his fury. James's eyes burned with disbelief. The empty bed, the tangled sheets, the stranger's flight. Her lies were more than just insults. They were an attack on everything he had ever trusted. As Claire continued her pitiful attempt at denial, James's voice cut through the air. "Ethan, is he really my son?" His question hung in the air like a bomb. The truth he had been avoiding for so long now surfacing. Claire's face went cold. She froze, her smile vanishing into the distance, replaced by a chilling indifference. Her lips parted, and with a casual shrug, she replied, "Maybe he's yours. Maybe he's not. Keep guessing." James stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. The truth had been written in Claire's eyes all along, but now it was undeniable. The months that followed were a chaotic whirlwind of accusations, legal battles, and emotional agony. Claire wasted no time in severing all ties with James. She left their home, moving in with a man she claimed was just a friend, but James knew better. She took full custody of Ethan, the child he had raised, loved, and cared for as his own. Claire didn't contest the divorce, her decision to move on swift and ruthless. But for James, the aftermath was unbearable. His once stable life now felt like a shattered mirror, with every jagged piece reflecting a distorted version of his former reality. Ethan remained with Claire, and James was left alone in their empty home, haunted by the memory of the boy who had called him daddy. But the cruel twist of fate gnawed at him. What if Ethan wasn't really his son? What if the boy he loved more than anything was the product of Claire's betrayal, not his own flesh and blood? The doubts consumed him. He tried to continue as a father, caring for Ethan from afar. But the weight of uncertainty was too much. Every time he saw Ethan's innocent face, the nagging question surfaced. Am I really his father? The emotional toll was immense. James, once a strong and confident man, crumbled under the pressure. He sought therapy, desperate to rebuild the pieces of his broken life, but the damage ran deep. His memories of Ethan, his first steps, the sweet sound of his voice saying "Daddy" for the first time, now felt tainted by the bitterness of betrayal. His career began to suffer. His once promising architectural projects fell behind schedule, and his physical health deteriorated. He lost weight, his sharp mind dulled by sleepless nights, and his passion for his work waned as his world seemed to unravel. But time, as it often does, began to heal. Slowly, James started to reclaim his life. He threw himself into his career once more, and his architectural designs flourished. He began to find joy in new hobbies, rekindling his fitness regimen, and even stepping back into the world of dating. He thought he had finally turned the page on the painful chapter of his marriage, just as it seemed like James was finding his balance. A phone call jolted him back into the nightmare he thought he had escaped. Claire reappeared, this time, not just as a specter from his past, but with a vengeance. It was a Tuesday like any other, until James was ambushed by the voice of his past. As he stepped out of his office building, the sound of Claire's furious shouting cut through the bustling crowd. His colleagues froze, turning to witness the spectacle unfolding. There she was, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, her face twisted in rage. "You walked away from your son. How could you leave him like that?" she screamed, her words sharp and biting. The venom in her voice stung more than the cold autumn air. James, momentarily stunned, felt the weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had believed Claire had moved on with her life, that their bitter divorce was behind them. But here she stood, a shadow of the woman he once loved, furious, desperate, and relentless. He took a deep breath, fighting the urge to lash out. Despite the burning anger inside him, he remained calm. With surprising restraint, he guided her away from the crowd, pulling her to a quieter corner of the building's entrance. "I didn't abandon anyone, Claire," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "You left, you took Ethan, and you moved on with your life. I have nothing more to say." But Claire wouldn't stop. She only grew louder, her words coming faster and with more venom. "You ruined everything," she cried, her eyes wild with accusation. "You're a coward. You couldn't face your responsibilities. You think you're above it all, leaving me and Ethan to fend for ourselves. You never cared about him." James's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. He had seen her manipulative ways before. He wasn't going to be fooled again. "I'm not here to listen to your lies, Claire," he said, his voice hardening. "I've given you all the space you wanted. But now, if you want me to step up, you need to prove something first. Prove to me that Ethan is actually my son." Claire's face twisted in disbelief. "You don't need a test," she shouted, her hands balled into fists. "He's your son. You should just step up and take responsibility." Her voice cracked with emotion, but James saw through it all. She was panicking, losing control. And it only made her more dangerous. But James remained unmoved. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "No test. No responsibility. Not until you prove it." Claire's face flushed with rage. And for a moment, it seemed like she might lash out physically. Her breath came in short bursts, and her entire body shook with fury. She wasn't used to being defied. "I'll never forgive you for this," she hissed before storming off, leaving James standing in the quiet aftermath. His colleagues slowly returned to their work, whispering behind their hands. But for James, the moment was crystal clear. Claire's manipulations were no longer going to control him. And if she wanted anything from him, she would have to face the truth first. In the days that followed their heated confrontation, Claire's behavior became increasingly erratic and desperate. It was as if the walls she had carefully constructed were slowly crumbling, revealing the frantic, vulnerable woman beneath. One evening, just as James was about to settle in for the night, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, Claire stood there, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice trembling with urgency. "James, please," she begged, her hands shaking as she clutched a crumpled letter. "I'm being evicted. I can't pay rent. And I'm running out of time. Ethan needs me. He needs a stable home." Her words were soaked with desperation, but James wasn't fooled. He had seen this act before. This wasn't the first time Claire had come to him in tears, only to twist the situation to her advantage. But now, she had a new weapon. "Ethan, I'm not asking for much, just a little help," she continued, her voice lowering as she tried to play on his emotions. "Please, James, I can't do this alone. I was wrong. I'm sorry, but Ethan, he needs you." James's heart clenched at the mention of his son, the boy he still loved as his own. But he knew better than to let his emotions rule him. He had been manipulated too many times before. He stood there, silent, as Claire's tears soaked the doorstep, and then, without a word, he shut the door. He couldn't let her back in. The following day, as he tried to focus on his work, James received a call from his mother. Her voice was tinged with concern. "James, I need you to listen. Claire came to me today. She's in a terrible situation. She's been evicted, and she's asking for help. I lent her some money, but I think she's really struggling." James's gut twisted. His mother had always been sympathetic to Claire, believing she was just a victim of circumstance. But James had long seen the manipulation in her eyes. He wasn't blind to the game she played. "She's not the person she was when she left you," his mother added, her voice soft but insistent. You can't just abandon her, James. You can't turn your back on Ethan. He's your son. The words cut deeper than he cared to admit. But he had to stay strong. Claire had taken everything from him. His trust, his family, his peace. And now she wanted to take his money? To manipulate him into taking care of a child that, for all he knew, might not even be his? No, James said firmly. I won't send her anything until she agrees to the paternity test. No more excuses. No more lies. His mother fell silent. But James could hear the disappointment in her voice. He knew she meant well, but her blind loyalty to Claire only made it harder. He wasn't going to let Claire's emotional blackmail dictate his life any longer. Claire had pushed him to his breaking point, but James was done being the pawn in her game. If she wanted anything from him, anything at all, she would have to prove that Ethan was truly his. No more manipulation, no more threats. Only the truth. Weeks had passed since their last encounter. But Claire's absence had not been as quiet as James had hoped. One evening, as James sat alone in his apartment, lost in his thoughts, the sound of his doorbell broke the silence. He hesitated but eventually stood up and opened it. Standing in front of him was Claire, her once polished appearance now gone, replaced by a woman weighed down by exhaustion and regret. Her clothes were disheveled, and her eyes, once sharp and defiant, were now dull and filled with tears. James? Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry. James felt the anger begin to rise within him, but he pushed it down. He wasn't going to let her manipulate him again. He stepped aside to let her in, only to see her break down once she crossed the threshold. She crumpled into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. I've made a terrible mess of everything, she confessed, her words tumbling out in a rush. I was wrong, James. I cheated on you. I was so lost after Ethan was born. I didn't know what to do. So, I turned to Mark. Her voice broke, and James froze. Mark, the man who had been a part of their lives during her maternity leave, a shadow lurking in the background, one James had always suspected. She continued, barely able to look him in the eye. I moved in with him after the divorce, hoping he'd be the one to take care of me, to take care of us. But he... Claire trailed off, her words faltering. He was never the man I thought he was. And now, I'm alone. I don't have a job, I don't have money, and Ethan needs me. He needs a father, James. He needs you. Claire's tears flowed freely now, and James could see the depth of her regret. But the damage had already been done. The web of lies, the betrayal, the manipulation, it had shattered his trust completely. How could he believe anything she said now? James's voice was steady, cold, as he took a step back. Take the test, he said flatly. I'll help if it's proven that Ethan is mine. But not before. Claire's face twisted in fury. Her hands clenched into fists, and she stood up abruptly, her entire body trembling with anger. You still don't trust me, do you? She hissed. After everything I've been through, you'll still treat me like this? She stormed toward the door, turning back for a final, venomous glare. You're heartless, James. You're nothing but a coward. With that, she slammed the door behind her, leaving James standing motionless in the silence. But this time, something inside him had shifted. James knew what he had to do. He wouldn't be fooled again. This time, he recorded every word, every detail of their interactions. Every conversation was documented, every threat cataloged. He would protect himself from the manipulations that had haunted him for so long. James wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting for his own peace of mind. And he wasn't going to let Claire, or anyone, take that from him. The months that followed were a blur of frustration and emotional turmoil for James. Claire's attempts to manipulate and guilt him into supporting her continued with relentless persistence. Every few weeks, a new sob story, a new demand, would surface, each one more urgent than the last. She told him of her worsening financial situation, of Ethan's supposed suffering, of her loneliness. But through it all, James remained resolute. He wasn't going to let her control him anymore. His mother, however, remained on Claire's side, clinging to the hope that James and Ethan shared a bond that could not be severed, despite everything. She continued to pressure him, pleading with him to relent, to support Claire for the sake of the child. But James's heart had hardened. The man he had once loved was gone, replaced by a manipulative stranger who had broken his trust beyond repair. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The legal battle dragged on. with Claire continuously stalling the paternity test, finding every excuse to delay it, even as she wore James down with her emotional appeals. His spirit was slowly crumbling under the weight of it all. He found himself questioning his own resolve. The longer the legal wrangling continued, the more the pressure built. Yet, despite everything, he clung to his decision. He wasn't going to be manipulated again. Then, one night, as James sat alone in his apartment, the silence seemed almost suffocating. He had just finished a late-night work session and was trying to unwind when his phone buzzed. It was Claire. He hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. But the voice on the other end wasn't the pleading, desperate Claire he had become accustomed to. This time, it was colder, more final. "James," Claire's voice cracked. But there was no emotion behind it. "I'm done. I'm leaving, for good this time." James's heart skipped a beat, but instead of the anxiety and fear he had once felt, a strange sense of relief washed over him. He listened as she continued, but her words were now meaningless to him. "No more calls. No more asking for help," she said flatly. "I'm on my own now. I won't bother you again." The line went silent. James sat back in his chair, the weight of the past few years finally beginning to lift. A strange mix of relief and sadness filled him. He had been through hell, had fought tooth and nail to preserve his dignity and his peace, and now it was finally over. Claire had made her last attempt to control him, and it had failed. But still, there was a part of him that felt a deep sadness for the child he had loved so much, for the family he had lost. As much as he had been hurt, the bond he once had with Ethan could not be erased so easily. He would always wonder what could have been. But for now, James was free. The storm had passed, and the silence was finally his. Thank you for listening. If you were James, what would you have done in his shoes? At what point did you realize the true depth of the betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss.